Emily Carter saw the SUV swerve, a split second before anyone else did. No thought, no calculation. Her body simply moved, pushing Richard Sterling out of harm's way. As her hands connected with his chest, they both saw the same thing, her bleeding, him desperate, the smell of gunpowder, and death. 1820. And then, Richard screamed, still on the ground, his eyes wide with terror. "You died. It's happened before, and you died." Emily didn't understand what he was saying. The noise of the accident still echoed. People were running. Someone shouted for an ambulance. She was on her knees, trembling, unsure why she'd thrown herself in front of a man she barely knew, Richard Sterling. The billionaire owner of the estate where she'd worked for only 3 weeks stared at her, as if he'd seen a ghost. Not just any ghost, the ghost of someone he'd loved and lost. But Emily Carter knew none of this. All she knew was that she was breathless, that her hands still tingled where they had touched him, and that, for the first time in months, since her husband's death, she'd felt something other than emptiness. She'd felt recognition, as if that man, that cold, distant stranger who never gave her a second glance, was actually the person she'd been waiting for her entire life. Richard recoiled, pulling away from her abruptly. He stood unsteady, gazing at her with a mix of confusion and fear, a look Emily had never seen on anyone's face. Then he said, barely a whisper, "Isabel." "Your name was Isabel." Emily blinked. "My name is Emily. Emily Carter." Richard shook his head, as if trying to wake from a nightmare. Security guards had already surrounded them, checking for injuries, keeping onlookers away. The SUV that had almost hit them was stopped a few feet away, crumpled against a lamppost. The driver, a middle-aged man, stumbled out, clearly in shock. But Richard didn't look at the car. He didn't look at the driver. He only looked at Emily, and she could have sworn she saw tears in his eyes. Tears from a man who, according to everyone at the estate, never showed emotion. If you've ever felt like you know someone you've just met, that there's a connection that makes absolutely no sense, you'll understand what Emily felt in that moment. She didn't know Richard Sterling, but her soul did, and that scared her, more than the accident itself. Paramedics arrived. They checked them both. No serious injuries, just shock. Richard refused to go to the hospital, but agreed to have his vitals checked right there. Emily tried to step away, to get back to her duties, to disappear into the crowd of staff and security. But Richard gripped her wrist. The touch was electric. She almost cried out. "Don't go," he said. His voice was different. Not the cold voice of the boss. It was the voice of someone terrified. "I need to understand what just happened." Emily didn't know what to say. She didn't understand it herself. So she simply nodded. 2 hours later, Emily Carter sat in the library of Sterling Estate, a room she'd never entered before. Only the senior housekeepers cleaned in there. She was in the kitchen, in the garden, in the hallways, and never in the library. But there she was, in a leather armchair that probably cost more than she earned in a year, with a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, trembling in her hands. Richard was across the table, looking at her as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. He'd taken off his dust-stained jacket from the accident. His tie was loose, and for the first time, Emily saw him less as the impeccable businessman and more as a man, a confused man, scared, human. "What did you see?" he asked suddenly. "When you touched me? What did you see?" Emily hesitated. If she told him the truth, he'd think she was insane. But if she lied, this strange feeling of connection, of destiny, of something bigger than she could comprehend, would never be explained. So she took a deep breath and said, "I saw blood. I saw you holding someone. A woman. She was dying." and you were crying. Richard closed his eyes. Emily saw his jaw clench, as if he were holding back something far greater than emotion, as if he was holding back centuries. Her name was Isabel, he said, opening his eyes. And I've been dreaming about her since I was 16 years old. Always the same dream, her dying in my arms. 1820. War. Blood. And me begging her not to go. But she always does. And she always dies. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to say it was coincidence, that dreams didn't mean anything, that visions during accidents were just the brain in shock. But she couldn't, because when she touched him, she hadn't just seen blood and death, she had seen love, a love so deep, so ancient, that it transcended any logic or reason. You think I'm her, Emily said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Richard stood up and walked to the window. Outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red. Colors of war, colors of blood. I don't know what to think, he said. But when you pushed me today, when you touched me, I didn't just see the dream. I lived it. I smelled the gunpowder. I felt the weight of her in my arms. And for the first time in 22 years, I understood why I have this dream. It's not a dream. It's a memory. Emily should have left. Should have said that he needed psychological help, that she was just a housekeeper who'd acted on instinct, that there was no connection between them. But she didn't leave, because deep down, she knew he was right. She had felt the same thing, the same impossible memory of something she'd never lived. Richard, she began, but he interrupted her, turning sharply. Do you have a mark? He asked. A scar, a birthmark, something on your left shoulder. Emily froze. How do you know? He took a step towards her. Because in the dream, Isabel has a mark, a scar in the shape of a star, right here. He touched his own left shoulder. That's where the bullet went in, where she was hit trying to save me. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't, because under the navy blue uniform she wore, under the long-sleeved white blouse, on her left shoulder, she had exactly that, a birthmark in the shape of a star. She had had it since she was born, never knew where it came from, never questioned it. It was just a mark, until that moment. Show me, Richard said. His voice was hoarse. Please. Emily knew she shouldn't. This crossed every professional, social, reasonable boundary, but her hands were already moving, pulling the sleeve of her blouse down, revealing her shoulder. The mark was there, small, but unmistakable, a 5-pointed star, as if it had been burned into her skin, or pierced. Richard Sterling, a man who controlled empires, a man who never showed weakness, fell to his knees. Emily heard the muffled sound of him hitting the Persian rug. She saw his hands trembling, saw tears streaming down his face, and then he said, in a broken voice that Emily would never forget, "It's you. After 203 years, I found you." Emily didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to run. Another part wanted to kneel down too, to hold the face of this man, who should be a stranger, but whom her soul recognized as someone she had loved in another life. So she did the only thing that made sense. She placed her hand on his left shoulder, gently, and felt the same electricity as before. Only this time, it didn't come with visions of death. It came with something older, deeper. It came with the certainty that, somehow, they had been together before, and that this time, something would be different. But what Emily and Richard didn't know yet was that the accident hadn't been an accident. that someone wanted Richard Sterling dead, and that the story of 1820 was about to repeat itself in a way that neither of them was prepared to face. Emily helped Richard up. He wiped his face quickly, as if ashamed to have shown so much emotion in front of a housekeeper. But when he looked at her again, the coldness didn't return. There was something different there: recognition, connection, and fear. "I need to understand this," he said. "I need to know if it's real, if I'm not going crazy." Emily nodded. "Me too." Richard went to a bookshelf and picked up a business card. He handed it to her. "Dr. Morales, he's my therapist, or was. I stopped going a few months ago. He specializes in regression, hypnosis, things I always thought were nonsense, but now I need to know. Would you come with me?" Tomorrow. Emily should have said no. She had a young son at home. She had bills to pay. She couldn't afford to dive into crazy past-life nonsense with her billionaire boss. But when she looked into Richard's eyes, she saw the same plea that she had seen in the vision, the same hopelessness and the same impossible love. And she said, "Yes, I will." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Lying in the small bedroom she shared with her 5-year-old son, Michael, she stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. She didn't believe in reincarnation, didn't believe in soulmates. She believed in hard work, in paying bill, in survival. But that birthmark on her left shoulder, that vision, that inexplicable recognition, how could she explain it? Michael slept beside her, his breathing soft and even. He was everything she had. Since her husband had died in a work accident 2 years ago, she had struggled alone to give her son a minimally decent life. The job at the Sterling estate was the best thing that had happened to her. It paid well, had benefits, does stability. And now she was risking it all because of an impossible connection with a man who lived in a completely different world from hers. But something inside her, something stronger than reason or fear, said that she needed to go, needed to know. Because if this was real, if she and Richard really had lived before, if she really had died for him over 200 years ago, then maybe there was a purpose to it. Maybe there was a reason why she had thrown herself in front of that car today without thinking twice. Maybe some connections really did transcend time and death. Or maybe she was going crazy, and either way, she would find out tomorrow. Meanwhile, across town, in his luxury penthouse, Richard Sterling couldn't stop looking at an object that he had kept his entire life, without ever understanding why. It was an antique locket, of silver stained by time. That had belonged to his great-great-grandfather. Inside it, there was a tiny, almost faded portrait. A young woman, with dark eyes and a soft smile. And below the portrait, engraved in almost illegible letters, 2 initials, I.C. Isabel Carter. Richard had never known who she was, only that his great-great-grandfather, a soldier in the Civil War, had died holding that locket, and that, somehow, the locket had passed from generation to generation until it reached him. Now, for the first time, Richard looked at the portrait and saw not just an unknown woman from the past. He saw Emily, the same eyes, the same smile, the same soul. And for the first time in his life, Richard Sterling believed in something bigger than business, power, or control. He believed in destiny, and that terrified him. Because if destiny was real, then Isabel's death was too. And if Emily really was Isabel reincarnated, that meant she was in danger, the same danger that had killed her 203 years ago. Richard picked up the phone and made a call. "I need extra security," he said. 24-hour surveillance for one of the housekeepers. Emily Carter. Don't let her out of your sight. The voice on the other end hesitated. "Any specific threat? Mr. Sterling?" Richard looked at the locket. at Isabel's face, at the woman he had sworn to protect, and had failed. "Yes," he said, "me. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt an inexplicable connection with someone, know that you are not alone. Some people believe that certain souls are destined to meet, life after life. And maybe, just maybe, what you felt was real." The next day, Emily and Richard met at Dr. Morales' office. It was a minimalist space. With white walls and a reclining chair in the center, the doctor, a man in his late 60s with thin-rimmed glasses, greeted them both with evident curiosity. Richard had explained over the phone that he needed an emergency regression session, but hadn't given details. When he saw Emily, Dr. Morales frowned. "She's participating in the session too." "Yes," Richard said. "I need you to regress both of us at the same time, if possible." The doctor hesitated. "That's not standard protocol, that, Richard. Hypnotic regression is an individual, delicate process. Doing it with two people simultaneously can cause contamination of memories, mutual suggestion." "I understand," Richard said, "but I need you to do it anyway. I need to know if what I saw is real. If she saw the same thing." Dr. Morales looked at Emily. "And you, Miss Carter? Do you agree to this?" Emily nodded. Despite the fear she felt, "I want to know the truth," the doctor sighed. "Very well, but I need you to understand. If you both have memories of past lives, and if those memories coincide, that doesn't necessarily prove they're real. It could be suggestion, expectation, unconscious desire. The human mind is powerful and can create convincing narratives." "I know," Richard said, "but if the memories match, if they both see the same details, the same events, then that's evidence enough for me." The session began. Dr. Morales asked them both to sit comfortably and close their eyes. He began counting down, guiding them both into a state of deep relaxation. Emily felt her body getting heavy, her mind becoming light. She heard the doctor's voice saying, "Now, I want you to go back. Go back to the most important moment you shared in another life. Go back to the moment that connects you." And then, Emily was no longer in the office. She was on a battlefield. The smell of gunpowder burned in her nostrils. The cries of wounded men echoed all around. She was wearing a white dress, stained with blood and earth. She had a makeshift medical kit in her hands. And in front of her, slumped against a tree, was a soldier, his face covered in dirt and blood, but she recognized the eyes, the same eyes as Richard Sterling. "Isabel," he said, his voice weak. "You need to go. They're coming. If they find you here, they'll kill you." Emily, or Isabel, shook her head. "I won't leave you. Not again." She began to treat his wound, her hands working fast, despite the tremor. He'd been shot in the abdomen. He was losing a lot of blood. She needed to staunch it, needed to keep him alive until she could get help. And then she heard it. Footsteps, voices, enemy soldiers approaching. Isabel looked at the man she loved and made a decision. She stood up, placing herself between him and the direction from which the soldiers were coming. She took the pistol from his belt and aimed. When the three soldiers appeared among the trees, one of them raised his rifle. Isabel fired first, but missed. And then came the gunshot. She felt the explosive pain in her left shoulder, the impact throwing her backwards. She fell into the arms of the wounded soldier, and they both collapsed to the ground. "No!" he cried. "Isabel, no, stay with me, please." She tried to speak, but blood filled her mouth. She tried to hold his hand, but her fingers wouldn't obey anymore. And then, with her last breath. She said, "I'll find you again. I promise. In another life, I'll find you, and this time we'll be together." And then everything went dark. Emily opened her eyes in the office, breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face. She looked to the side and saw Richard also waking up, also crying. And then he said, his voice choked with emotion, 1820, April. Battle of Carabobo. I was Corporal Richard Sterling, and you were Isabel Mendoza, the daughter of the regiment's doctor. You saved me 3 times before that. And on the 4th, you died. Emily couldn't speak. She just nodded, because she had seen the same thing, felt the same thing, lived the same death. Dr. Morales was pale. In 30 years of his career, he had never seen 2 people have the same regression, the same details, at the same time. You both saw the same scene, he said, more to himself than to them. This shouldn't be possible, but it was. And now Emily and Richard knew the truth. They had been together before. She had died for him. And somehow, 203 years later, they had found each other again. The promise had been fulfilled, but knowing the truth and accepting the truth were 2 completely different things. When they left the office, Emily was silent. Richard tried to talk to her, but she just shook her head. "I need time," was all she said, before getting into a taxi and leaving. That night, back in her small apartment, Emily tried to convince herself that it was all crazy. Hypnotic regression didn't prove anything. It was suggestion, imagination. 2 people wanting to believe in something bigger because their current lives were unsatisfactory. Richard was a lonely billionaire who had lost his family young. She was a widow, struggling to survive. Of course, they both wanted to believe in a transcendental connection, but that didn't make it real. She looked at Miguel, sleeping peacefully in his small bed. He was real. The bills to pay were real. The job she couldn't lose was real. Connections from past lives, promises made in 1820. That didn't pay rent, didn't put food on the table. That didn't give her son a future. The next day, Emily went back to work, determined to keep her distance from Richard. She would do her job, get her salary, and forget all that reincarnation nonsense. But when she arrived at the estate, she found Richard waiting for her in the kitchen. He wasn't dressed for work. He was in casual clothes, hair messy, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept. "We need to talk," he said. Emily looked around. Other housekeepers were present, preparing breakfast, organizing the house. "Not here," she said softly. "It's not appropriate." Richard nodded and left. But he left a note on the table where Emily was working. When she opened it, she read, "Library, noon. Please, I have something to show you." Emily crumpled the note. She shouldn't go. But she knew she would. Because, as much as she tried to deny it, she had felt it too. The connection, the memory, the certainty that she and that man had shared something far beyond this life. At noon, Emily entered the library. Richard was there, waiting. And on the table, there were old documents, digitized photographs, printed pages from historical archives. He had spent the night researching. "Look at this," Richard said, pushing a document towards her. "It's a military record from 1820, Battle of Carabobo, list of casualties. Look at the name." Emily read, "Corporal Richard Sterling, wounded in combat, survived, treated by Isabel Mendoza, civilian medical assistant, daughter of Dr. Javier Mendoza. Isabel Mendoza, deceased on site, gunshot wound." Emily felt her legs weaken. It was real. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't suggestion. It was documented. They had really existed. "And there's more," Richard continued, picking up another document. "This is the report of an officer who witnessed it. He wrote, 'Miss Mendoza demonstrated extraordinary courage in placing herself in the line of fire to protect the wounded corporal. Her death is an irreparable loss to the regiment.'" Emily couldn't process it. It was too much, too real, too impossible. How could this be happening? How could she be reading about her own death? That had occurred 200 years before she was born. "You still don't believe it," Richard said. "I understand. I wouldn't believe it either. But there's one last thing." He picked up the antique locket that Emily had seen briefly in the regression session. He opened the locket and showed her the tiny portrait inside. "This locket belonged to my great-great-grandfather, Corporal Richard Sterling. He died in 1856, holding this. Look at the portrait." Emily looked and felt the world spin. The portrait, despite being faded and tiny, was unmistakable. It was her. Or rather, it was Isabel. But Emily and Isabel, they had the same face, the same eyes, the same curve to their smile. And beneath the portrait, the initials, IM, Isabel Mendoza. "You've kept this your whole life." "Without knowing who she was," Emily whispered. "And now you've discovered it was me." Richard nodded. "And beneath the portrait, on the other side of the locket, there's an inscription." He turned the locket over. Emily read the words engraved in Old Spanish. "Te encontraré de nuevo. Prometo. I will find you again. I promise." The same words Isabel had said before dying in the regression, the same words Emily had spoken without ever having heard them before. The promise had been real, and it had been kept. Emily sat down, trembling. "What does this mean? What are we supposed to do with this?" Richard pocketed the locket and looked at her with an intensity that frightened her. "It means you can't die for me again. It means that this time, and I'm going to protect you. It means that this time, we're going to be together." Emily shook her head. "Richard, I have a life. I have a son. Responsibilities. I can't just drop everything. Because we had a life together 200 years ago. That doesn't change who we are now. You're a billionaire. I'm a housekeeper. We live in different worlds. In our last life, I was a poor soldier, and you were the daughter of an aristocratic doctor," Richard replied. "We also lived in different worlds, and even then, you chose me. Even then, you died for me. The roles have reversed, Emily, but the connection hasn't. And you know it. You feel it." Emily wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Because he was right. She did feel it. From the moment she had touched him, from the vision, from the regression, she knew. They were soulmates, connected through time, destined to find each other. "But what if this is a curse?" she whispered. "What if we're destined to meet, but never be together? What if it always ends in tragedy?" Richard approached and took her hands. "Then we change the destiny. We don't repeat history, then we learn from it. You died protecting me. This time, I protect you." But Emily had a bad feeling, a weight in her chest that said the story was far from over. And that, somehow. The danger from 1820 had followed them to 2025. She wasn't wrong. That same afternoon, while Richard was in a business meeting, and Emily was at the estate with Dylan, who she had brought because school was closed, she received an anonymous call. A distorted voice said, "You should have died in the accident. Next time, you will die. And the child too." Emily hung up, terrified. She ran to get Dylan, who was playing in the garden under the supervision of another staff member. She held her son tightly. Someone was threatening her, and her son. But why? What would you do if you discovered that someone wanted to kill you, but you didn't know who or why? Emily had nowhere to run, no money to escape, no protection. She only had one certainty. This had something to do with Richard, and with the accident that had not been an accident. When Richard returned to the estate, and Emily told him about the call, he turned livid. He immediately called his security team. They doubled the surveillance, placed personal bodyguards for both Emily and Dylan. And Richard had Emily and her son move into the estate, at least temporarily. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised. "Not again." But at night, alone in the luxurious guest room that she never imagined she'd sleep in, Emily looked at Dylan sleeping beside her and wondered if she had made the right choice, whether getting closer to Richard put her in danger, or if staying away would be even worse. And then she had a dream. No, it wasn't a dream. It was a memory. Another memory from 1820. She saw Isabel and the soldier Richard together before the battle, saw him give her the locket, saw her promise that she would stay with him forever, and saw something else, saw the face of the enemy soldier who had shot her, and the face was familiar, very familiar. Emily woke up in panic. She grabbed her phone and searched, entered Richard's company website, looked in the executive section, and there it was, Mark Salazar, vice president. The man who had tried to get Richard to name him as successor, the man who had lost a power struggle 6 months ago, and the man whose face was exactly the same as the soldier who had killed Isabel. Emily didn't know if it was coincidence or if reincarnation also applied to enemies. But she knew one thing: Mark Salazar was dangerous. And if she was right, he was responsible for the accident and for the threat. The next morning, Emily told Richard about the dream, about the soldier's face, about Mark Salazar. Richard was silent for a long moment, then said, "Mark tried to remove me from the company last year. When he failed, he swore I would pay. I thought it was just rhetoric. But if you're right, if he really is, if he also reincarnated, then he came to finish what he started in 1820, Emily completed. Came to kill you, and I'm in his way again." Richard held her face. "I won't let it. I won't let history repeat itself. I'll confront him. I'll discover the truth." But Emily was afraid. Because if Mark was the same soldier from 1820, he would also remember. And if he remembered, he would know exactly how to make Emily and Richard suffer. He would know exactly how to destroy them, again. And then the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Emily remembered something that Isabel had seen in the memory, something she hadn't mentioned to Richard. In the Battle of 1820, Isabel hadn't been hit by accident. The soldier had aimed at her specifically because she was protecting Richard, because killing her was the best way to destroy him. And if Mark Salazar knew that, if he also had memories of that life, then the threat wasn't against Richard, it was against Emily, and against anyone she loved, including Dylan. History was repeating itself, and this time, Emily would have to decide: flee and maybe save her son, or stay and risk losing everything again. But there was a difference, and in 1820, she had no choice, and now she did. And maybe, just maybe, choosing differently would change the destiny. But before Emily could decide anything, Richard entered the room with a grim expression. "Mark has disappeared," he said. "Left the country this morning. But before leaving, he left a message for me." He grabbed his phone and showed it to Emily. The message said, "You never protected her. Not in 1820. Not now. She always chooses to die for you. And this time, it won't be different. But I'll give you a chance. Give me the company, or she and the child die." Emily felt her blood run cold. Mark knew. He remembered. And he was using the same tactic as always, making Richard choose between power and love, between life and death, between destiny and free will. And for the first time, Emily understood why she and Richard had been torn apart back in 1820. It wasn't just the war. It wasn't just bad luck. It was Mark. It was Mark Sterling. He was the one who had orchestrated everything. He'd ensured that Isabel met her tragic end. And now, 203 years later, he was trying it all over again. Richard looked at Emily, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll hand the company over to him," he choked out. "I won't risk losing you." But Emily shook her head firmly. "If you do that, he'll kill you anyway," she warned. "And then he'll come after me. We can't back down. We have to fight. This time, we have to change history." And it was in that very moment that Emily realized something that Isabel never had. The promise wasn't just about finding each other. It was about learning. It was about growing. It was about finally overcoming together what they had never managed to conquer apart. The fear, the violence, the destiny that seemed written in blood. This time, Emily wouldn't die for Richard, and Richard wouldn't let her. This time, they would fight together. And maybe, just maybe, 203 years of waiting would finally be worth it. Richard immediately gathered his security team and lawyers. They traced Mark's message. They discovered he'd fled the country, but had left specific instructions. There was a deadline. 72 hours for Richard to transfer control of Sterling Enterprises, or Emily and Miguel would be dead. But there was something more. While investigating, they uncovered financial records showing that Mark had hired the driver in Emily's car accident. He'd planned it all. And it wasn't the first time. Over the past 3 years, since the power struggle had begun, there had been at least 4 attempts on Richard's life that had seemed like accidents. A construction beam falling at a building site, brakes cut on his private car, a suspicious fire in his office while he was working late. All events that Richard had attributed to sheer bad luck or negligence. But they weren't. They were Mark, trying to kill him. And now, with Emily back in the picture, Mark had found the perfect weapon, threatening the one person Richard loved, the same tactic that had worked back in 1820. Emily stared at the reports scattered across the desk in Richard's office and felt the weight of history crushing down on her. Mark wasn't just trying to kill Richard for power or money. He was finishing something he'd started 200 years ago, an obsession that had transcended lifetimes, a hatred that had been reincarnated along with them. "We need to understand why," Emily stated. "Why does he hate us so much? What happened in 1820 besides the battle?" Richard looked at her with a strange expression. "I had another dream last night," he said quietly. Or memory. I don't even know the difference anymore. He took a deep breath. "Before the battle, Mark and I served in the same regiment. We were friends. Until he found out about Isabel. About us." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Go on," she urged. Richard closed his eyes, reliving the memory. Mark was in love with Isabel too. She had treated a wound of his months before the battle. He asked her to marry him. She turned him down because she'd already chosen me, a poor soldier, and he never forgave that. He swore that if he couldn't have her, no one could. "So, at the battle," Emily whispered, "he didn't just shoot Isabel. He killed her on purpose. Out of jealousy, out of revenge." Richard nodded, tears in his eyes. "And now, he's doing the same thing and It doesn't matter how many lifetimes pass. It doesn't matter how many bodies he uses. He'll never stop. Until he destroys us. Emily felt anger surge inside her, an anger that came not just from this life, but from the previous one too. Isabel had died forgiving, had died believing that the soldier who killed her was simply following orders. But he wasn't. He had chosen. He had aimed. He had pulled the trigger intentionally. And now, 200 years later, he wanted to do the same thing to Miguel, to an innocent child who had nothing to do with this madness. "No," Emily said, her voice firm. "We're not going to let it happen. We're not going to run. And we're not going to give in. We're going to face him. And this time, we're going to win." Richard looked at her with surprise and admiration. "How?" Emily grabbed her cell phone. "We have 72 hours. That's enough time to make Mark come back, to confront him, and to ensure that, this time, he doesn't escape." The plan was risky, but it was the only chance they had. Richard would make a public statement saying he was transferring control of Sterling Enterprises to Mark. He would schedule a board meeting to make it official. Mark would have to return to take over, and when he did, they would be waiting, with evidence, with witnesses, and with the police. But Emily knew that Mark wouldn't be so easy to catch. He'd been planning this for years. He had resources, connections, and memories of a lifetime of military tactics. He wouldn't fall for an obvious trap. So Emily added another piece to the plan, a piece that Richard hated, but that she insisted on. She would be the bait. "If you reveal yourself," Richard protested, "he'll try to kill you immediately." "I know," Emily said, "but it's the only way. He doesn't just want the company. He wants to see me dead. He wants to see you suffering. It's personal. And personal means emotional. And emotional means mistake. He'll act on impulse. And when he does, we'll grab him." Some people might pause here and think that Emily is being reckless, that she's risking too much. But what if? You knew that this was the only way to break a cycle of violence that had lasted 200 years. And what if? Not risking it meant condemning not only you, but all future versions of you, to relive the same trauma, the same loss, the same tragedy. Would you risk it? Emily did. 2 days later, Mark Sterling returned to the country, confident, smiling, ready to take over the empire he had been trying to steal for years. The meeting was scheduled at Sterling Enterprises headquarters on the executive floor. Security guards were positioned. Undercover police officers were present. And Emily, against all of Richard's instinct, was there too, sitting in the conference room, waiting. When Mark walked in and saw her, something changed on his face. For a fraction of a second, Emily saw it. Recognition, anger, and something deeper. Desire. Obsession. The same obsession that had motivated a soldier to kill the woman he loved, because he couldn't have her. "Isabel," Mark said, and everyone in the room looked at him, confused. Only Emily and Richard understood. "You still choose him, even after everything, even knowing he never protected you." Emily stood up, slowly. "You remember?" Mark smiled, a cold smile. "Dangerous. Ever since I was 14, dreams, memories, a war I fought, a woman I loved, and a traitor who stole her from me." Richard started to move, but Emily signaled for him to stop. She needed to do this and needed to confront the man who had killed her, not just in this life, but in the last. "You didn't love me," Emily said. "You wanted to own me, like property. When you couldn't have me, you tried to destroy me. And now you want to do the same thing." Mark took a step toward her. "I gave you a chance, Emily. I asked you to marry me. I could have given you a life of wealth, of status. But you chose some poor soldier, someone who couldn't even protect you when it mattered. Emily felt the ache in his words, the same ache that Isabel must have felt, the same confusion. But this time, she had something Isabel didn't: clarity. I didn't choose wealth or status. I chose love. And you will never understand that. Because you don't know what love is. You only know what possession is. Theus Mark's face twisted. And where did that love get you? It got you a grave, nah. It got you death. And it'll get you there again. He glared at Richard. Because he'll never be able to protect you, just like he couldn't in 1820. That's when Richard finally spoke, his voice calm, but lethal. You're right. I didn't protect her, and I've carried that guilt for 203 years, but this time, I'm not a wounded soldier on the ground. This time, I'm standing, and you will not touch her. Mark laughed. You think that matters? You think standing changes anything? I have men out there, I have plans, I have control, and you two have what? A promise from 1820? Love? Love doesn't stop bullets. Emily took another step toward Mark. You're right, love doesn't stop bullets, but we're not alone this time. And you're not some soldier on a battlefield with no witnesses. You're a criminal. In a building full of cameras, police, and evidence. You've already lost, you just don't know it yet. That's when Mark realized it. The security guards he thought were his were actually police. The cameras he thought were off were recording everything. And the confession he had just given about killing Emily in 1820, about the accidents, about his plans, was being recorded. But Mark Sterling wasn't a man to accept defeat, especially not twice. He pulled out a gun he'd hidden under his jacket. He pointed it at Emily and said, "If I can't have you, no one can, just like in 1820, just like now." And then everything happened in slow motion. Mark pulled the trigger. Richard yelled and threw himself in front of Emily. But this time something was different. Emily moved too, not forward like Isabel had, but to the side, pulling Richard with her. The bullet sailed through the air where they both had been a second before and slammed into the wall. Security guards and police tackled Mark to the ground. The gun was ripped from his hand. He screamed. He fought, but he was overpowered. And as he was dragged out of the room in handcuffs, he looked at Emily and Richard together, standing, alive. And for the first time in 203 years, Mark Sterling understood he had lost. Again. But this time, definitely. Emily clung to Richard, trembling. They were alive. Both of them. They had broken the pattern. They had changed destiny. And as police led Mark away, as lawyers prepared formal charges for attempted murder, corporate terrorism, and a dozen other crimes, Emily and Richard embraced. And finally, after 203 years, felt something they had never felt together. Peace. But it wasn't over yet. There was one last piece. One last revelation that would change everything. That night, after Mark was arrested and the charges were formalized, Emily and Richard returned to the estate. Mikey was there, sleeping peacefully, protected, unaware of the danger he'd been in. Emily kissed him on the forehead and felt deep gratitude that he was alive, that she was alive, that everyone was alive. Richard found her in the library, looking out the window at the moonlit garden. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. "It's over," he whispered. "Finally. It's over." Emily turned to face him. "There's something I haven't told you yet. About the regression. About the memory from 1820. Richard frowned. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath. "When Isabel died in your arms, she didn't just say she'd find you again. She said something else. Something I didn't understand. Until now. Until I saw Mikey." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Our son will find us too, and guide us back to each other.'" Richard was stunned. "Son? Isabel was pregnant?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. 2 months. You didn't know. She hadn't told you yet. She was waiting for the war to be over. But she never got the chance. She died, and the baby with her. Richard stepped back, reeling, processing. I lost you, and I lost our son. He covered his face with his hands. 200 years. I carried the guilt of losing you. But it was more than that. It was both of you. Emily cupped his face in her hands. But what if what Isabel said was true? What if our son really did find us? Richard looked at her, confused. But Mikey is your son, from your marriage. Emily shook her head. I know. But last night, as I watched him sleep, I had a memory. Or a vision. I don't know. I saw Isabel holding a baby. Not yet born, but there inside her. And the baby had a mark, a birthmark, in the shape of a crescent moon, behind his left ear. So Richard went pale. Emily. She finished the sentence for him. Mikey has the same mark, behind his left ear. A crescent moon. I always thought it was just a coincidence. But what if it isn't? What if he is? The son we lost in 1820, Richard whispered. Reincarnated. He found us. Through you. Through me. He brought us back together. Emily didn't know if it was true or just a wish so deep that her mind was creating connections where they didn't exist. But when she looked at Richard, she saw the same certainty that she felt. Mikey wasn't just her son. He was their son. Through time. Through lives. Isabel's promise had been fulfilled on a level neither of them could have imagined. And finally, after 203 years of separation, pain, and loss, the family that had been destroyed in 1820 was reunited in 2025, not in the way they expected, but in a way that was even more profound, because this time, they knew. This time, they remembered. And this time, no one would separate them again. Richard fell to his knees in front of Emily, took her hands in his and said, "Marry me. Not because we were Isabel and Richard, but because we're Emily and Richard. Because I love you in this life. Because I want to be Mikey's father. Because I want us to be a family. A real family. Now." Emily looked at the man kneeling before her. The billionaire who had turned out to be a soldier from 1820. The stranger who had turned out to be her soulmate. The boss who had turned out to be the love of multiple lifetimes. And said the only thing that made sense, yes. 1,000 times, yes. They kissed. And for the first time in 203 years, the promise was sealed not with blood and death, but with love and life. The cycle was broken, the tragedy was over, and a new story, a story of light and not of shadow, was just beginning. 3 months later, Emily Carter's life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Mark Salisbury was in jail, awaiting trial for attempted murder, conspiracy, and a laundry list of other crimes that would guarantee he'd spend the rest of his days behind bars. His memories of 1820, his confessions about killing Isabel. It had all been documented. Forensic psychiatrists were fascinated by the case. Some called it shared delusion, others, more open-minded, suggested that perhaps there was more between heaven and earth than modern science could explain. But Emily didn't care what they called it. She knew the truth. And the truth was that she, Richard, and Michael were a family, not just by choice, but by destiny, by promise, by a love that transcended time. The wedding was small, just close friends and a few members of the estate staff who had become family. Michael, at 5 years old, was the ring bearer. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew that Richard was special. He knew that when the tall man picked him up, There was something familiar, something safe, something that felt like home. And when Richard formally adopted Michael a week after the wedding, giving him the Sterling surname, there was a moment when the child looked up at his adoptive father and said something that made both adults freeze. "I know you," Michael said, "from before, from long before." Richard and Emily exchanged a glance. They hadn't told Michael about reincarnation, about 1820, about anything. He was too young. But apparently, some memories were deeper than age or understanding. Some memories were etched into the soul. Richard's dreams changed. He still saw 1820, still saw Isabel dying in his arms. But now, the dream continued. He saw Isabel transforming into light, saw her smiling, and saw her saying, "I found you. Finally, I found you." And the dream ended not with death, but with the image of Emily, alive, in his arms in the present, the promise fulfilled, the nightmare transformed into a dream. Emily had her visions too, but they were different now. They weren't just of 1820. They were of other lives. Fragments, moments. She saw Richard as a farmer in the 18th century, saw him as an artist in the Renaissance, saw him as a monk in the Middle Ages, and in each life, she saw herself too, sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always, always connected, always searching, always finding. Through centuries and civilizations and countless reincarnations, some connections aren't created. They are eternal and just waiting to be remembered. This story isn't just about Emily and Richard. It's about anyone who's ever felt an unexplainable connection, anyone who's ever looked at a stranger and felt recognition, anyone who's ever had a vivid dream of a time they never lived. Because maybe, just maybe, these aren't coincidences. Maybe they're memories. Maybe they're promises being fulfilled. A year after the wedding, Emily was pregnant. When the ultrasound revealed it was a girl, Richard cried, and that night, he had a different dream. He saw Isabel in 1820, pregnant, holding her belly. She looked at him through time and said, "Our family is complete, finally complete." And when the baby was born, perfectly healthy, with dark eyes like Emily's and Richard's gentle smile, they named her Isabel, not just in honor of the past, but as a bridge between who they were and who they are, between 1820 and 2025, between death and life, between promise and fulfillment. Michael adored his little sister instantly. He protected her with a fierceness that seemed far beyond his 6 years, as if, on some deep level, he knew he had failed to protect her once. And this time, he wouldn't fail. This time, he'd be there. Richard transformed the estate into a real home. The cold hallways filled with children's laughter. The empty rooms became nurseries and playrooms, and the library, where it all began, where Emily had revealed her birthmark, became the family's favorite place, where, on cold nights, they gathered, where Richard read stories to Michael and Isabel, where Emily watched them and felt gratitude so deep it almost hurt. Because she knew this wasn't guaranteed. She knew that in 1820, this family had been destroyed before it even began. She knew that without the accident, without the courage to throw herself in front of that car, without the willingness to confront the impossible and believe the unbelievable, they would never have gotten here, never have had this second chance. This chance to do everything right. Dr. Morales visited the family a few times. He was writing a paper on shared reincarnation, using Emily and Richard's case as a central study, but always respecting their privacy, using pseudonyms, focusing on the science more than the personal story. And every time he visited, he was impressed, because he came looking for rational explanations, but found only magic. Magic in the way Richard looked at Emily, Magic in the way Michael protected his little sister. Magic in the way a family that shouldn't exist, that had been separated for 200 years, had finally reunited. "Some things don't need explaining," Dr. Morales said once. "Some things just need to be witnessed. And I have the honor of witnessing a miracle. The story can't be told without mentioning what happened to Mark Salisbury. He was sentenced to life in prison. But 6 months after the sentencing, something strange happened. He asked to see Richard, and when Richard, and against everyone's advice, went to visit him, Mark was different, smaller, broken. "I remember everything now," Mark said through the glass of the visiting room. "Not just 1820. I remember before, from other lives, and in all of them, I was the antagonist, the villain, the destroyer." He looked at Richard with empty eyes. "Do you think souls can change? Or are we stuck in patterns forever?" Richard thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I think souls can learn, but only if they want to, only if they choose to. You chose hate in 1820. You chose revenge now. But you still have a choice. You still have time. Maybe not in this life, but in the next. And the next after that. Until you finally choose differently." Mark didn't respond. He just nodded. And when Richard left, he felt something he never thought he'd feel for Mark Salisbury. Pity. Because while he, Emily, and Michael had broken their cycle, Mark was still trapped in his. Still the jealous soldier who couldn't have what he wanted. Still the soul that chose possession over love. And perhaps, in 200 years, when everyone meets again, Mark will finally have learned, finally have changed. But this isn't Mark's story. This is the story of Emily and Richard. And their story has a happy ending. Not because everything was perfect. Not because there weren't challenges, arguments, were difficult moments, but because this time, they faced everything together. This time, no one died for anyone. This time, they lived together on their 5th wedding anniversary. Richard took Emily back to the library, back to the place where it all began. He had something to give her. It was the locket. The 1820 locket with Isabel's portrait. He opened it, but had made a modification. On the other side of Isabel's portrait was now a portrait of Emily, and underneath, a new inscription: "Promise kept, eternal love, 1820 and 2025. Emily held the locket, tears in her eyes. "It's perfect." Richard smiled. "Isabel made a promise. You kept it. And now, I make a promise. No matter how many lives come, no matter how many times we're reborn, I will find you. So always, and we'll be together. Always." Emily kissed him, and when they kissed, they both felt something, a spark, a connection, and for a fraction of a second, they saw not just 1820, not just the other fragmented lives, but the future. They saw themselves old, surrounded by grandchildren, saw Michael grown, strong, protective, saw Isabel grown up, beautiful, wise, and they saw that the promise didn't end in this life. It would continue forever, because some souls aren't meant to be apart. Some souls find each other through wars, through deaths, through centuries of darkness, and when they finally meet again, nothing, absolutely nothing, can separate them again. The final lesson of all this? It's not about reincarnation. It's not about proving whether past lives exist or not. It's about something deeper. It's about recognizing connections when you find them. It's about not being afraid to love deeply, even when it seems impossible. It's about believing that some promises transcend time, space, and even death. Emily Carter saved Richard Sterling from that car because her soul remembered what she had promised 203 years before. And when she jumped, she wasn't just saving a man. She was fulfilling a destiny. She was breaking a cycle. She was proving that love, true love, doesn't die. It just waits, patiently, through eras, until it can blossom again. And now, you who have heard this story need to ask yourself, is there someone in your life that you feel you've known before? Someone whose eyes seem to carry memories that you've never shared in this life. Someone who, when they touch you, makes your heart remember something that your mind can't explain. Because maybe that person isn't a coincidence. Maybe it's a promise being fulfilled. Maybe it's a soul that you loved in another life, coming back to find you in this one. And if it is, don't let fear, logic, or skepticism stop you. Because Emily almost did. Richard almost did. But when they finally believed, when they finally surrendered to the impossible, they discovered that the love they had lost in 1820 had never really died. It just waited. And the waiting, however long it was worth every second. This story shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be possible. But it does. And it is possible. And maybe, just maybe, your story of impossible connection, of inexplicable recognition, of love that seems to transcend this life, is also real, is also a promise being fulfilled, is also proof that some things are bigger than birth and death. Some things are eternal. And if you've ever felt that, if you've ever lived that, if you've ever found your soulmate from another life, then you know. You know that this story isn't fiction. It's memory. It's recognition. It's the validation of what your heart has always known, but your mind feared to believe, that true love never dies. It just transforms. It just waits. It just finds a way back. Always. Emily and Richard proved it. Michael guided them back to each other. Isabel, the baby, completed the circle. And now, where before there was only tragedy and loss, there is home, there is family, there is love that survived 203 years of separation and emerged stronger, deeper, more eternal than anything that death could destroy. The promise was kept. The cycle was broken. And two souls who loved and lost each other in 1820, finally and in 2025, are together forever. And if this story touched you in some way, if it made you think of someone, if it made you feel something inexplicable, then maybe it's time to pay attention. Because maybe your soul is trying to tell you something. Maybe it's trying to remind you of a promise you made, of a love you lived, of a connection that never died, just waited for you to remember. What's your story of inexplicable connection? What's the promise that your soul remembers but your mind has forgotten? Share in the comments. Because stories like this need to be told, need to be remembered, need to be honored, and maybe by sharing, you'll find others who also remember, who also feel, who also know that eternal love isn't fantasy. It's the deepest truth that exists. Emily Carter and Richard Sterling are proof of that. And now, you can be too.